Liberalism, Chapter 8, Self-Consciousness, False Consciousness, and Conflicts in the Community of the Free. Section. Return to the question, what is liberalism? The well-born, the free, and the liberals. Having briefly reconstructed periods in the history of liberalism and the concrete politico-social relationships developed in its name, we must now return to our opening question. Use of the term liberal is usually dated to the political struggles that developed in Spain in the wake of the 1812 revolution and the opposition that emerged between liberals, engaged in defending the Constitution, and their opponents, whom they branded, quote, servile. Only now is the adjective transformed into a substantive. In fact, in revolutionary America, the author of an article opposed to the institution of slavery had already signed himself, quote, a liberal. But that is not the key point. When we come across a text from 1818 in which Consc sets out and supports the program of the Liberal Party, it can be said that we are dealing with an adjective. The political meaning of the term is clear, and implicit in it is the transition to the noun employed to define members of the party in question. On the other hand, there is not much difference between this stance in favor of the Liberal Party and the stance in favor of the liberal political system that we have seen make its appearance in a text by Washington as early as 1783. Hence, the real problem is to identify the moment when, partly inheriting and partly transforming the meaning bequeathed by a long tradition, the term liberal began to assume its modern political meaning. This was the precondition for the transition from the adjective to the substantive. It was a semantic event that cannot be uncoupled from the actual history of the liberal movement and liberal revolutions. We can start with the Glorious Revolution. Arguing against Robert Filmer, defender of the thesis that the Almighty had conferred exclusive ownership of and dominion over the earth to Adam, the first absolute monarch, Locke objected that God had bestowed his blessings, quote, with a liberal hand. The hypothetical absolute property owner or monarch who, rather than displaying, quote, liberal allowance, sought to exploit the needy situation of all other men in order to reduce them to, quote, hard service, or even the condition of a, quote, vassal, would be acting no differently from the bandit who threatened a man with death in order to reduce him to slavery. Clearly, liberal is synonymous with generous here. However, God's liberal generosity is in contradiction with the political slavery that Filmer would like to impose on all men. The, as it were, constitutional and liberal God presupposed here refutes the claim of absolute monarchy. The vile, miserable condition of the vassal, of the individual subjected to hard service, of the servant or slave, was incompatible with the mode of being and feeling, in the first instance, of an Englishman and, quote, gentleman, who scornfully rejected the servile view that, quote, we are all born slaves. In his turn, Hume, on the one hand, used the term liberal synonymously with disinterested and generous, and on the other criticized illiberal, the popular agitation and plebeian riots that characterized the First English Revolution. Similarly, Smith distinguished in the moral field between the liberal view, peculiar to the well-off classes, restive at overly rigid bans on, quote, luxury and the other pleasures of life, and the, quote, strict or austere view, peculiar to poorer classes, who, by force of circumstance, could not indulge in, quote, thoughtlessness and dissipation, end quote. In the context of the liberal-servile opposition that was crystallizing, the liberal attitude was defined by antithesis either to the absolute power of the monarch, or the servile, or even merely plebeian condition. The liberal/illiberal dichotomy referred to a difference and conflict between two worldviews, but also between two social conditions. In the course of the American Revolution, adopting a position in favor of conciliation of the rebel colonists, Burke deplored the restrictions on individual liberty introduced in Britain on account of the war, and regretted the fact that, quote, the liberal government of this free nation is supported by the hireling sword of the German boors and vassals." End quote. Once again, the liberal profession of faith criticized the unwarranted expansion of the crown's power, on the one hand, and distanced itself from the subaltern classes, subjected to work and hence servile, on the other. We can now understand the British Whigs' scorn for those who, in the name of a so-called, quote, indiscriminate freedom, wish to appeal to the servile hands of slaves or emancipated slaves to suppress the revolt of colonists, who, precisely as slave owners, nurtured with particular sincerity the love of liberty that must dwell in any non-servile soul. And we can also understand why, as early as 1790, on account of the restructuring of the nobility's political influence, the, quote, liberty of the French seemed to the British statesman to be contaminated with, quote, coarseness and vulgarity. It is not liberal. End quote. Opposed to anything vulgar and plebeian, quote, liberal tended to be synonymous with aristocratic. In fact, among Virginia's slave owners, the, quote, aristocratic spirit was intimately bound up with a, quote, spirit of liberty, distinguished by its, quote, more noble and liberal character. While paying homage to the, quote, liberal government of this free nation, Burke declared himself a member of the aristocratic party, the party, quote, connected with the solid, permanent, long-possessed property of the country, end quote, and felt committed to fighting with all his energy for aristocratic principles and the aristocratic interests connected with them. During the American Revolution, along with the celebration of the, quote, liberal political system we have already noted, we find in Washington a celebration of patrons of the, quote, liberal arts, contrasted with, quote, mechanics, with immigrants of a modest social condition from Europe. But particularly illuminating is the discourse of John Adams. For a well-ordered liberty to be achieved, it could not be mechanics and the common people, quote, without any knowledge in liberal arts or sciences, end quote, who exercise power. Instead, it must be those who had, quote, received a liberal education, an ordinary degree of erudition in liberal arts and sciences, and that they were the, quote, well-born and wealthy, end quote. In France, too, the Liberal Party, which was in the process of being formed, defined itself during the polemic against the absolute monarchy, but also, and possibly above all, against the popular masses and their vulgarity. Attention was turned to the Third Estate, to those circles where, quote, a sort of affluence allows men to receive a liberal education, end quote. Expressing himself thus was Sieyès, who subsequently played an important role on the occasion of the 18th Brumaire in 1799. Sealing the coup d'etat was the, quote, proclamation of General-in-Chief of Bonaparte, who announced the disbandment of factions, i.e. of popular and plebeian agitation, and the triumph of, quote, conservative, tutelary, liberal ideas, ideas conservatrices, tutelares, liberales. This language was not the invention of a general, however brilliant. He enjoyed the support of the liberal circles of the time. The adjectival usage just noted refers to them. Constant, who later, as we know, declared himself a member of the Liberal Party, had already been recommended by Talleyrand to Napoleon in 1797 as a man, quote, passionate about liberty, and as an, quote, unshakable liberal republican. The following year, Constant had underlined the Directory's merit in having, quote, proclaimed its unshakable attachment to the conservative system, end quote. Finally, shortly after the coup d'etat, he paid homage to, quote, France's tutelary genius, which, from the 9th of Thermidor, has rescued it from so many dangers, end quote. Synonymous with aristocratic in Burke, liberal was now synonymous with conservative and tutelary. For Constant, as for Madame de Staël, the cause of liberalism found expression in, quote, respectable people, honnêtes gens, or as Necker made clear in a letter to his daughter, well-off, quote, decent people, gens de bien, end quote. As in England and America, so too in France it was the property-owning classes, proud of their non-servile condition and spirit, who tended to define themselves as liberals. This is further confirmed, even after the mid-19th century, by de Tocqueville's stance. Those genuinely capable of defending the cause of liberty against Louis Bonaparte's, quote, illiberal government were not the, quote, people, strictly speaking, with their incomplete education, but the property owners, the bourgeoisie, the men of culture, in a word, all those who have received a liberal education, end quote. Under the spur also of popular struggles, the liberal-servile dichotomy gradually tended to lose its class connotation and came to refer exclusively to political ideologies. But at moments of acute struggle, the original meaning re-emerged with all its discriminatory charge. For de Tocqueville, as we shall see, anyone who wanted to endow the ideal of liberty with a social content was, quote, made for serving, end quote. Bitter conflicts could, and did, develop within the property-owning classes. Debating with Burke, who suspected wealth not rooted in the mother country's land and soil of lacking in patriotism and even of subversive tendencies, Mackintosh declared that, quote, the commercial or moneyed interest has been less prejudiced, more liberal, and more intelligent than the landed gentry, end quote. Similarly, in France, Sieyès saw liberal education embodied in the Third Estate, and certainly not in an aristocracy used to pursuing, quote, the favor of servitude at court. Invitations not to discriminate and create conflicts between the different types of property were more frequent. In the view of the anti-Jacobin Jean-Joseph Monnier, in addition to the United States, the country that had diffused, quote, in the France the idea of liberty, was England, construed in fact as the country where, quote, a liberal education without genealogical tests confers the quality of gentleman, end quote. It is clear that the term liberal was generated by a proud self-consciousness, which had a simultaneously political, social, and even ethnic connotation. We are dealing with a movement and party that intended to rally persons furnished with a, quote, liberal education, and genuinely free, or people who had the privilege of being free, the, quote, chosen race, as Burke put it, the, quote, nation in whose veins the blood of liberty circulates, end quote. All this is not surprising, as has been made clear by distinguished scholars of the Indo-European languages. Quote, freemen is a collective notion, a sign of distinction that applies to the well-born and them alone. For this very reason, outside the community of the free and the well-born, not only was service or slavery not excluded, it was even presupposed. In Cicero's view, at the head of the liberi populi was Rome, which engaged in the mass enslavement of defeated peoples considered unworthy of freedom. Similarly, in 18th century liberal England, what became a popular song, Rule Britannia, lauded in these terms the empire that had just wrested the asiento, a monopoly on the slave trade, from Spain. Quote, this was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain, Rule Britannia, rule the waves, Britain never will be slaves. End quote, and end of section.